She was the only Hadza woman in generations who had earned the right to lead the epeme, the sacred hunting dance that men guarded jealously. When Marcus, a British photographer, offered to document her artistry for the world to see, Zawadi agreed, believing she was preserving her culture. What Marcus didn't know, she was using him, trading photographs for intelligence about British military movements to protect her people from forced relocation. What Zawadi didn't know, he would present her sacred ritual as primitive spectacle for London's entertainment, turning her into an exotic curiosity, objectified and fetishized by audiences who saw performance, not prayer. By the time she discovered how her images were being sold, she faced an impossible choice: remain silent and continue gathering vital intelligence, or expose his exploitation and lose the information that could save her tribe. But Marcus had his own secrets, and when he discovered she'd been using him all along, the question became, who was truly exploiting whom? In the dry season of 1898, in the thorn bush country surrounding Lake Eyasi in northern Tanzania, Zawadi did something that should have been impossible. She killed a kudu bull with a single poison arrow shot from 40 paces, tracked a wounded lion for 2 days without rest, and brought meat to her starving clan during the worst drought in living memory. Those accomplishments alone would have made her remarkable among the Hadza people, one of humanity's oldest continuous cultures. But what made her truly extraordinary was what happened next. The elders granted her the right to lead the epeme, the sacred hunting dance that for generations had been the exclusive domain of men. The epeme was not entertainment. It was not performance. It was the soul of Hadza identity made visible, a dance that connected hunters to their prey, honored the spirits of animals taken, and passed hunting wisdom through movement that words could never capture. Men spent years earning the right to participate, let alone lead. Women, no matter their hunting prowess, had been excluded since time immemorial, until Zawadi. At 24 years old, she had short-cropped hair adorned with ostrich eggshell beads, skin like honey-warmed earth, and eyes that had seen too much death too young. Her mother had died in childbirth. Her father had been killed by a lion when she was 12. Rather than marry as expected, she had taken up her father's bow and learned to hunt with a determination that first scandalized, then impressed, and finally awed her community. The night she first led the epeme, elders who had initially opposed her wept openly. Her movements captured the patience of the hunter's stalk, the explosive power of the kill, the reverence for the animal's sacrifice. She danced not as a woman trying to imitate men, but as a hunter who had earned wisdom through blood and survival. It was this dance, this sacred, powerful, unprecedented performance that caught the attention of Marcus Ashford. Marcus was a photographer from London, 29 years old, with dark, wavy hair, sharp, observant eyes, and the kind of charm that made people forget he was there to extract something valuable. He had arrived in East Africa 6 months earlier with expensive German cameras, official permits from the colonial administration, and a mission that he described as preserving vanishing cultures before they disappear. What he actually did was more complicated. Marcus photographed indigenous peoples with genuine technical skill and aesthetic sensibility. His images were beautiful, undeniably so, but they were also commodities, sold to magazines, exhibited in galleries, published in books that presented African cultures as exotic curiosities for European consumption. He told himself he was documenting, preserving, honoring. He rarely examined too closely what he was actually doing, extracting cultural capital from people who had no control over how their images would be used. When he heard rumors of a Hadza woman who led the sacred hunting dance, he knew he had found something rare, a story that would captivate London audiences hungry for the exotic and the unprecedented. He arrived at Zawadi's clan's camp on a morning when smoke from cooking fires mixed with the honey-colored light of dawn. The Hadza lived with minimal possessions, grass-thatched shelters built in hours, easily abandoned when game moved or water sources dried. They were among the last true hunter-gatherers, living as humans had for tens of thousands of years before agriculture, before cities, before everything Marcus's civilization considered progress. Zawadi was preparing poison arrows when he approached, carefully coating obsidian points with extract from the desert rose plant. One drop could kill a giraffe. She handled it with the casual competence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "You're Zawadi," Marcus said in passable Swahili, the trade language. "I've heard about your dancing." She looked up, assessing him with the same evaluative gaze she used when tracking dangerous game. She saw expensive leather boots, impractical for this terrain, camera equipment with more than her clan earned in a year, the confidence of someone who had never been truly vulnerable. "And you're the picture maker," she replied in English that surprised him with its fluency, "the one who captures souls in boxes." A missionary had taught her English years ago, believing education would lead to conversion. Instead, Zawadi had learned the language, extracted what useful knowledge the missionary possessed about the colonial administration, and maintained her traditional beliefs entirely unchanged. She had learned early that knowledge of your enemy's language was power. "I don't believe in soul capturing," Marcus said with a smile designed to disarm. "I believe in preservation. Your culture is extraordinary. The world should know about it before." He stopped, realizing the sentence ended poorly no matter how he phrased it. "Before we disappear," Zawadi finished flatly, "we've survived 50,000 years. We'll survive the British too." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. The colonial administration was different from previous threats. They weren't just another tribe to avoid or negotiate with. They were systematically dismantling the Hadza way of life, claiming their ancestral lands, forcing them into settlements, trying to convert them to farming people who stayed in one place. It was cultural extinction dressed up as civilization, which was why, when Marcus asked if he could photograph her performing the epeme, Zawadi said yes. Not because she believed his story about preservation, not because she was naive about how the images might be used, but because she saw an opportunity. If this British photographer wanted access to sacred rituals, she would give it to him, and in exchange, she would get access to something far more valuable: information. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Marcus would arrive at the camp with his cameras, and Zawadi would perform. Not the full epeme, but carefully selected portions she deemed appropriate for outsider eyes. Some movements were too sacred to share. Some knowledge was not his to take. But while Marcus focused on his photographs, checking light angles and adjusting his equipment, Zawadi focused on gathering intelligence. She learned that British military patrols passed through the region every 3 weeks. She discovered which colonial administrators were sympathetic to native peoples, few, and which were openly hostile, most. She overheard conversations about plans to establish a native reserve, essentially a concentration camp where the Hadza would be forced to abandon hunting and adopt agriculture. Marcus, entirely focused on his artistic project, never noticed that Zawadi's questions were strategic. When she asked about his travels, she was mapping British movements, When she inquired about his meetings with colonial officials, she was learning who had authority over Hadza lands. When she requested he photograph certain locations, she was documenting British military installations for the scattered resistance fighters who occasionally sought her counsel. Zawadi was a spy, a brilliant one, and Marcus was her unwitting asset. But something complicated the clean transaction. She began to genuinely like him. Marcus was different from other British colonizers she'd encountered. He listened when she explained the epeme's meaning rather than just snapping photographs. He asked intelligent questions about hunting techniques. He showed real curiosity about Hadza astronomy, ecology, social structures, not as curiosities but as sophisticated knowledge systems. One evening, after a particularly long photography session, they sat watching the sunset paint the acacia trees gold and crimson. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said, his voice careful. "Why did you agree to this? I know you don't trust me. I see it in your eyes every time I raise the camera." Zawadi considered lying, but found herself speaking a partial truth. "Because the British are coming, whether we cooperate or resist. The question is whether we disappear entirely or whether something of who we are survives. If your photographs preserve even a fraction of our culture after we are forced from these lands, perhaps they serve a purpose." It was true, in a way, just not the whole truth. Marcus looked at her with something she hadn't expected to see in a British face: genuine sorrow. "I wish I could say you're wrong about what's coming, but I've seen it happen across Africa. The administration sees your nomadic lifestyle as primitive and unproductive. They want everyone settled, taxed, controlled." "And you?" Zawadi asked. "What do you want?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, at first I wanted photographs that would make me famous. Images exotic enough to sell in London galleries. But spending time here, learning from you," he gestured at the vast landscape, the endless sky. "I've started to question what we call civilization. You have no poverty because you share everything. No theft because you own nothing. No war because you have no territory to defend. And we call this primitive?" Zawadi felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but recognition. This man might be capable of seeing her as human, not just exotic subject. It made what she was doing feel less clean. Using someone who saw you as fully human was different from using someone who viewed you as a curiosity. But she pushed the discomfort aside. Her people's survival mattered more than her conscience. What Zawadi didn't know, as she watched the sunset beside Marcos, was how her images were already being used in London. The first batch of photographs had been shipped weeks ago, purchased by magazines hungry for content about darkest Africa. And the captions being written bore no resemblance to Marcos's respectful explanations of Hadza culture. The letter arrived 3 months into their collaboration, delivered by a colonial courier to the administrative outpost 20 miles from Zawadi's territory. Marcus retrieved it during one of his supply trips, expecting routine correspondence from his London gallery. What he found instead made his hands shake. The savage beauty, Africa's dancing huntress, revealed. Read the headline of the magazine clipping enclosed. Below it, a full-page photograph. Zawadi mid-dance, body coiled in the moment before the hunting strike, ostrich shell beads catching sunlight, every muscle defined with the grace of a hunting cat. The image was breathtaking. The caption was horrifying. Deep in the primitive lands of German East Africa, British photographer Marcus Ashford has captured the stunning Zawadi, a tribal woman whose wild beauty and untamed dances offer Europeans a rare glimpse into the savage grace of Africa's vanishing peoples. Unlike the demure women of civilization, this huntress moves with the primal sensuality of an animal. Her performances representing the raw, uninhibited nature of cultures, yet untouched by Christian moral refinement. It continued in that vein for 3 paragraphs, each sentence worse than the last. Words like primitive, savage, wild, and exotic appeared repeatedly. Her sacred ritual was described as tribal spectacle. Her spiritual devotion was interpreted as primal instinct. Her artistry was reduced to native entertainment. Marcus felt sick. This wasn't what he'd written in his submission notes. He had described the epeme as sophisticated ritual dance, Zawadi as a master artist, the Hadza as a highly successful culture adapted to their environment over millennia. Someone at the magazine had stripped away all that context and replaced it with colonial fantasy, the image of the exotic savage that European audiences craved. The second page was worse. Advertisements. His photographs of Zawadi were being licensed for postcards, sold as curios from darkest Africa. A theatrical company in London was planning a Savage Africa show featuring dancers attempting to recreate the epeme, choreography based on fetishized misunderstanding of his images. And the price list? His photographs of Zawadi could be purchased for display in private homes. European men were literally buying images of her sacred performance to hang in their parlors like hunting trophies. Marcus knew he should destroy the letter. Zawadi could never see this. It would shatter the fragile trust they'd built. But before he could decide, Zawadi herself appeared. She had tracked him to the outpost. Following his movements was trivially easy for someone who could track wounded animals through miles of bush. "You left before dawn without telling anyone," she said, suspicion clear in her voice. "What are you hiding?" Marcus tried to fold the letter, but Zawadi was faster. She snatched it from his hands with reflexes honed by hunting. Her eyes scanned the English text. She read slowly but comprehensively, the missionary's lessons serving her well now. He watched her face change as she read. Shock, disgust, fury, and underneath it all, something more painful. Betrayal. Savage beauty, she read aloud, voice shaking. Primal sensuality. Untamed. They're writing about me like I'm an animal in a zoo. Zawadi, I didn't write those captions. I never intended. You took the photographs. Her voice cracked with rage. You pointed your camera at something sacred and sold it to people who see me as a curiosity, a primitive to be gawked at. You said you wanted to preserve my culture, but what you really did was turn it into entertainment for people who think we're barely human. That's not fair, Marcus protested. But even as he said it, he knew it was exactly fair. He had taken her image, something she had created with her own body and spirit, and sent it into a system he knew would distort and exploit it. He had told himself he was documenting. He had been extracting. Fair? Zawadi laughed bitterly. You want to talk about fair? Your people take our land, force us from our homes, destroy our way of life, and then photograph us as vanishing peoples, as if you're not the ones making us vanish. And I was foolish enough to help you do it. She threw the letter at his feet and turned to leave. Wait, Marcus called desperately. Please, let me make this right. I'll demand they remove the photographs from sale. I'll write corrections, insist on proper context. Zawadi spun back, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in her eyes that terrified him. Not anger, but calculation. "No," she said slowly. "Don't demand anything. Not yet." Marcus blinked, confused. "What?" "I need time to think," Zawadi said. "The photographs are already out there. Demanding their removal might make things worse. I need to understand the full situation before deciding what to do." It was a lie. Zawadi had already decided, but she needed Marcus to believe she was still considering her options, because she needed him to keep providing information. The intelligence she'd gathered over the past 3 months had revealed something crucial. The British were planning a massive relocation effort in 6 weeks. They would forcibly move all Hadza clans to a settlement camp where they would be required to farm instead of hunt. It would be cultural death, slow but certain. The resistance fighters needed more information, timing, troop numbers, routes, and Marcus, racked with guilt, desperate to make amends, would be more useful than ever. So Zawadi made a decision that would haunt her. She would continue to work with Marcus, continue to let him photograph her, continue to smile and answer his questions. She would use his guilt as a weapon, extract every piece of intelligence she could, and worry about her own compromised soul later. After all, he had used her. Why shouldn't she use him? But as she walked away from the outpost, Zawadi felt something cold settle in her chest. The photographs had changed how the world saw her, but more frighteningly, they had changed how she saw herself. Was she still a dancer performing sacred ritual, or had she become what the captions claimed, a spectacle, a curiosity, an exotic object for consumption? And if she continued working with Marcus, using him as he had used her, who would she become? Over the following weeks, their relationship became a hall of mirrors, each manipulating the other, each thinking they held the advantage, neither entirely sure anymore where performance ended and genuine feeling began. Marcus, desperate to atone for the exploitation, became more careless with information. He left maps visible, discussed British military plans openly, invited Zawadi to his camp where documents lay unguarded. He thought he was rebuilding trust. He was actually providing intelligence that would save lives. Zawadi gathered everything methodically: troop movements, supply routes, the exact date of the planned relocation. She passed this information to resistance contacts, who melted in and out of the bush like ghosts. Hadza clans began quietly relocating beyond British reach, moving to territories the maps didn't show, disappearing into landscapes only they knew how to survive. But something unexpected was happening. Zawadi was falling for him. Not the version of Marcus who had sold her image as exotic spectacle, but the man who sat with her under the stars learning the names of constellations in Hadza, who asked careful questions about plant medicines not to extract secrets, but because he genuinely wanted to understand, who had begun to question everything his culture had taught him about civilization and savagery. One night, after teaching him to identify poison arrow plants by moonlight, Marcus said something that stopped her breath. "I've been thinking of staying, not going back to London. There's nothing for me there except a career built on, well, on what I did to you. I could make a different life here, learn properly, not just document, maybe work with missionary doctors, use my limited medical knowledge to actually help, rather than extract." Zawadi looked at him sharply. "You would give up everything? Your career, your country, your people?" What's the point of a career that requires me to betray decent people? Marcus replied. Zawadi, I know you probably can't forgive me for how those photographs were used. But if I could spend the rest of my life trying to make amends, trying to be useful to the Hadza in ways that actually respect your autonomy. It was the word autonomy that cracked something in Zawadi's defenses. He saw her as a person with the right to control her own image, her own story. How many British colonizers thought in those terms? Marcus, she said slowly, there's something I need to tell you. She was about to confess everything, the spying, the intelligence gathering, the fact that she had been using him from the beginning. It suddenly seemed impossible to build anything real on a foundation of mutual manipulation. But before she could speak, they heard sounds. British soldiers crashing through the bush with the subtlety of a wounded buffalo, and leading them, pointing directly at Marcus's camp. One of the colonial administrators Marcus had befriended, a man named Captain Reynolds. Marcus Ashford, Reynolds called out in clipped military tones. You are under arrest for espionage and providing intelligence to native insurgents. Marcus's face went white. What? I've done no such thing. Reynolds held up a document, one of Marcus's own maps, annotated with information about patrol routes. Information Marcus had carelessly left visible. Information Zawadi had copied and passed to resistance fighters. This map was found on a captured insurgent, Reynolds said coldly, with your handwriting noting British troop movements. Care to explain? Marcus looked at Zawadi, confusion and dawning horror crossing his face. You took my maps? You were spying? I was surviving, Zawadi said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. You think you're the first British man to arrive with pretty words about preservation? You took my sacred dance and sold it as savage spectacle. I took your information and used it to protect my people. The only difference is you profited from your extraction and I didn't. The words were harsh, designed to hurt. But underneath, Zawadi felt something tearing apart inside her. Because it wasn't entirely fair. Marcus had been careless and culturally destructive. Yes, but he had also been trying to change, to grow, to become better. And she had used that growth against him. You let me think. Marcus's voice broke. I was falling in love with you. Was any of it real? Before Zawadi could answer, before she even knew what her answer would be, Reynolds interrupted. How touching. Native honey trap seduces foolish photographer. A tale as old as colonialism itself. He gestured to his soldiers. Arrest them both. The photographer for espionage, the woman for conspiracy and theft of military intelligence. Wait, Marcus said desperately. She didn't steal anything. I gave her access willingly. If anyone is guilty of espionage, it's me. Let her go. Reynolds laughed. Admirable chivalry, but pointless. She's the more valuable catch. My superiors will be very interested to learn about an English-speaking native gathering intelligence. She'll tell us everything about the resistance network, one way or another. The threat was clear. British interrogation of natives rarely involved pleasant conversation. I'll confess to everything, Marcus said quickly. Full espionage, deliberate intelligence sharing, everything. Just let her go. She's just a dancer. I'm the one who betrayed Britain. Marcus, don't, Zawadi said sharply. They'll hang you. Better me than you, he replied. And in his eyes, Zawadi saw something that made her heart break. Genuine love, offered without condition. even after discovering her betrayal. Reynolds considered. Interesting proposal, but I think we'll keep you both. You, Ashford, will be tried for treason in a British court, quite the scandal for a London photographer. And you, he turned to Zawadi with predatory interest, will help us locate every resistance fighter between here and Dar es Salaam, or we'll make an example of your entire clan. It was checkmate, unless Zawadi did something she'd sworn never to do. She used the one weapon her grandmother had taught her was too dangerous to ever deploy. She spoke in the formal ceremonial Hadzain that summoned witnesses. Within minutes, Hadza hunters emerged from the bush, 20, 30, 50 of them, appearing like ghosts. Reynolds's small patrol was suddenly very outnumbered. The British had rifles, true, but the Hadza had poison arrows, knowledge of terrain, and 50,000 years of experience surviving in this landscape. You can arrest us, Zawadi said calmly, but then you'll have to explain to your superiors why you lost an entire patrol to primitive natives armed with bows. Or you can let us both walk away, and this becomes a story of a photographer who got lost in the bush and a native woman who was never here at all. Reynolds's face went through several colors before settling on calculated pragmatism. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and smart enough to know that colonial administrations didn't reward officers who lost soldiers to savages. You have 1 hour to disappear, he said finally. After that, if I ever see either of you in British territory again, you'll both hang. As Reynolds and his humiliated patrol retreated, Zawadi and Marcus stood in the clearing surrounded by Hadza warriors, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between them. You called them, Marcus said quietly. Your people. To save me, even after I exploited your culture, even after you discovered I'd let your image be turned into spectacle. And you tried to take my sentence, Zawadi replied. To hang in my place, even after discovering I'd been using you for intelligence all along. They looked at each other, and in that moment, both saw the mirror image of their own complicated motivations. Neither purely exploiter nor purely victim, neither simply user nor simply used. Just two people who had started as adversaries, attempted to use each other, and somewhere in the process, against all logic, fallen in love. Marcus and Zawadi couldn't stay in British-controlled territory. Reynolds had made that clear, but neither could they simply return to how things were before. They made an unconventional choice. They traveled to German East Africa, where Marcus had contacts among missionary doctors and where the administration was slightly less aggressive toward the Hadza. There, Marcus used his remaining savings to establish something unprecedented. A documentation project controlled by the people being documented. Instead of Marcus photographing Hadza culture for European consumption, Zawadi and other Hadza learned photography themselves. They decided which aspects of their culture could be shared, which must remain sacred, and how images would be contextualized. Marcus handled technical training and distribution logistics, but the Hadza controlled their own representation. It wasn't perfect. European galleries still preferred exotic images over authentic documentation. Publishers still wanted captions about primitive peoples, rather than sophisticated explanations of sustainable hunter-gatherer ecology. But slowly, carefully, they built something different, a model where indigenous people controlled their own narrative. And the controversial photographs, the ones that had objectified Zawadi as savage beauty, Zawadi made a surprising decision. She demanded they remain in circulation. Not because she forgave the exploitation, but because she wrote her own captions, powerful, angry essays about colonialism, objectification, and the violence of extraction. She turned the images meant to exoticize her into tools for education about colonial harm. Let them see what they did, she told Marcus when he questioned the strategy. Let them see how they looked at me, not as artist or hunter or teacher, but as exotic curiosity. Let them be uncomfortable with their own gaze. Some of those revised images became famous for entirely different reasons than the originals. Zawadi's essays appeared in progressive publications, were read by anti-colonial activists, sparked conversations about representation and consent that were decades ahead of their time. As for Marcus and Zawadi themselves, their relationship remained complicated. They married in a ceremony that blended Hadza traditions with Marcus's cultural background, but their partnership wasn't the romance of fairy tales. It was built on mutual acknowledgement of harm done, ongoing negotiation of power imbalances, and constant work to do better. Do you ever regret it? Marcus asked one evening, 5 years later, as they watched their daughter, a child of two worlds, play with other Hadza children. Agreeing to those first photographs? Everything that came after? Zawadi considered. I regret the harm, the exploitation, the objectification, but I don't regret the complexity. You taught me that my enemy could become my partner. I taught you that your good intentions didn't erase your harm. We both learned that love and exploitation can coexist, and that choosing love means constantly working to eliminate the exploitation. She took his hand. You asked me once who was truly exploiting whom. The answer is, we both were, and we both got hurt, and we both changed. That's not a happy ending exactly, but it's an honest one. Marcus squeezed her hand, thinking of the young photographer who had arrived in Africa seeing cultures as material for his career. I destroyed your images, he said quietly. All my negatives of the epeme. I kept one photograph, just one for myself. But I'll destroy that too if you want. Keep it, Zawadi said. But know what you're looking at. Not an exotic dancer. Not a savage beauty, not a primitive curiosity, just a woman who survived colonialism, used what weapons she had, and made the best of impossible choices. In the end, their story became neither triumph nor tragedy, but something more complicated and true. Two people from opposite sides of a vast power imbalance who hurt each other, used each other, and somehow, through painful honesty and constant work, built something resembling justice. The photographs that had objectified Zawadi became, in her hands, tools for liberation. The career Marcus had built on extraction became, through transformation, a partnership of equals, and the dance that had started as manipulation became, against all odds, something like love. Not the love of fairy tales, where obstacles dissolve and everyone lives happily ever after, but the love of real life, imperfect, constantly negotiated, built on the wreckage of harm acknowledged and the hard work of becoming better than you were.